Okay, now Potter also says in his analysis of this, he says, the proponents of the documentary hypothesis have focused their Pentateuch research on a place and a period that is actually relevant to the origins of the Book of Mormon. Palestine between the time that the tribes of Israel were divided into two kingdoms, and this happened, of course, in 922 BC, and the destruction of Jerusalem in 587 BC. This was the era of the grandparents, great-grandparents, and great-grandparents of Lehi and Nephi. So, and this is the relevant period for understanding what is the background knowledge and understanding of Lehi's religious education. This is the time period. This is precisely the period that the various sources of the Book of Mormon, or the Bible, was put together. The J, the E, the P, the D. I might note in passing there are some scholars who now argue that the E source isn't really a separate source. So things are getting interesting in the scholarship. I think because of the consistency, as Elliot Friedman has shown, I think the consistency demonstrates the E source really was there. We'll see. Time will tell. I also think, from the LDS perspective, that our Book of Mormon definitely demonstrates a beautiful consistency with just that source, the E source. This gives legs to that E source. So anyway, this was the era that experts believe at least 4 versions of the Book of Moses were written and initially edited into one text. Now we're talking at least 4 versions. There could have been more. At this point, it's understood to be 4 sources. Now Jan Jodal, early on in the early 1900s, 1920s, 30s, and 40s, he uses the second verse in the Book of Mormon to explain why this is important when we try to tie the initial authors of the Book of Mormon to the ancient world. And I thought this was a nifty little insight. It's things like this that keep me coming back and back and back to the Book of Mormon and to the Hebrew Bible and to the Greek Septuagint as you analyze the languages, as you analyze the way the Hebrew is used, as you analyze the Book of Mormon. New things keep coming out. How many dozens of times do you have to read this before you get it all? You can't get it all. That's the beauty of the Scriptures. The greatest intellectual challenge are the Scriptures, in my opinion. It is certain that if these verses had been penned by a modern impostor, this is Jodal saying this, he would not have written the language of my father, but rather he would have written Hebrew. You notice that in the very first or second verse in the first chapter. Here we are again, back at the first chapter. The language of my fathers is how Nephi explained this. He didn't say Hebrew. He didn't identify the language. Why is this important? I'll tell you why it's important. Well, Jodal will. Because that is the term that is now used, that we have, that denotes the language spoken and recorded by the Jews at the time of Lehi, around 600 BC. But Nephi did not know that language he was writing in by that name of Hebrew. So he called it the language of my father. Have you ever thought of that before? I thought that was quite fun. Very interesting here. The expression used is therefore unmistakable evidence of the genuineness of the Book of Mormon, of at least Nephi's recording this. They didn't call it Hebrew back then. It was the language of their fathers. Oh, my father learned it, and his father learned it, and so on and so forth. So that's the language I'm still. We call it Hebrew. Isn't that fascinating? Well, if the finest biblical scholarship, and I'm on page 123, I'll be through from page 123 to 133, pretty much, in Potter's book. If the finest biblical scholarship, providing compelling evidence, placing the Book of Mormon authors in Palestine between 922 and 587 BC, it would be downright naive to argue that anyone wrote the book in New York in the 1820s. One of Potter's ideas. Now, the brass plates contained the genealogy of Nephi's family, indicating that he was a descendant of Joseph. That's 1 Nephi 5:14. And confirming that he was not Jewish or of the tribes that formed the southern kingdom of Judah after the division of the kingdom following Solomon's death. Nephi's golden plates tell us that he was from the tribe of Manasseh, Alma 10:3, and that his wife was of the tribe of Ephraim. Both tribes had been part of the northern kingdom of Israel. The Book of Mormon's first authors were from tribes that had once formed the kingdom of Israel. So here's the first test, using this documentary hypothesis to explore various features of the Book of Mormon, and how the Book of Mormon records certain information within its pages. Not just in one or two places, but it is actually scattered throughout the entire Book of Mormon, which is really, really strong in its favor. The first test is the multiple versions of the Pentateuch, that is, the first 5 books. Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. Penta is Greek for 5, Pentateuch, 5 books. A primary premise of the documentary hypothesis is that there is evidence that many versions of the Book of Moses probably existed during the time the brass plates were written. This was certainly the case in Nephi's time, and Friedman summarizes this hypothesis. There was evidence that the 5 books of Moses had been composed by combining 4 different source documents into one continuous history. For working purposes, the 4 documents were identified by alphabetic symbols. The document that was associated with the divine name Yahweh, Jehovah, was called J. The document that was identified as referring to the deity as God, which is the Hebrew Elohim, was called E. The third document, which is by far the largest of the 4, including most of the legal sections and concentrating a great deal on matters having to do with the priests, was called P, and the source that was found only in the book of Deuteronomy was called D. So we have the JEPD. And this is why. What did Nephi see on the brass plates? Joel suggests that the collection of Laban known in the Book of Mormon as the brass plates must have been unusually complete, judging from the contents. It must have been a very valuable library. Fortunately, Nephi provides an itemized accounting of the separate documents contained on the brass plates. So now when we reread this incident about the brass plates in the Book of Mormon, we'll pay better attention to it, won't we? Listen to this. This is interesting. And this includes 4 sets of scriptures. At least 3 were Mosaic in nature, having prophecies dating back to the beginning, according to 1 Nephi 5, 11 through 13. The evidence of documentary hypothesis for versions JEPD correlates remarkably well to what Nephi found on the brass plates. Here's what he found. Number 1, the brass plates included the 5 books of Moses, in verse 11. Which compares to the combination of versions J and E in the biblical Pentateuch. We have JEPD, and then they call the redactor, the one who put it all together, the R source, R for redactor, the compiler, like Mormon and Moroni was, with the Book of Mormon plates. The brass plates included the 5th book, or version D. The complete hexateuch, J, E, and P blended, was not combined until Ezra's day, and that was after they returned from Babylon to Jerusalem to rebuild the temple under Cyrus, of all people, who was called the Lord's Messiah, interestingly enough. When you study the Hebrew, that gets real interesting. So the second thing that the brass plates did is they contained a record of the Jews from the beginning. Compares to version J, the version whose authors came from the kingdom of Judah. Then number 3, the brass plates also included a separate collection of prophecies of the holy prophets from the beginning. This compares to version E, whose authors, like Nephi, came from the tribes that had formed the kingdom of Israel. And the 4th thing about the brass plates that Nephi observed is it contained many prophecies which had been spoken by the mouth of Jeremiah. This compares with the book of Jeremiah. And finally, Nephi describes no set of brass plates equivalent to the P or the priestly version. Now, the conclusion of biblical scholars is that during the period when Nephi lived, there were different accounts of the stories from the beginning up to Moses. And this is precisely supported by the inventory that Nephi provided of the brass plates that is found in our Book of Mormon.